I'm Carol Biaggi. Welcome to Bloomberg's Masterclass, the show that travels to universities across the country to hear what business students, professors, and top-name guest lecturers have to say about the biggest issues facing corporate America. We recently visited the University of Florida's Warrington College of Business to sit in on a case study of a momentous weekend in U.S. business history. It was back in mid-September when Ken Lewis and John Thain decided to do a deal that helped change the face of the U.S. financial system. The title of the class, Impulse, Inspiration, or Intuition, Bank of America's Saturday morning decision to buy Merrill Lynch. The class was part of a course given by Bruce Furster, president of South Beach Capital Markets. Mr. Furster has been teaching a course on capitalism at Warrington for the past several years. Two special guests joined the class that day. Win Smith Jr. is a former chairman of Merrill Lynch International, executive vice president of Merrill Lynch, and member of the Executive Management Committee. He is also the son of Winthrop Smith, who was a pillar at Merrill Lynch for more than a generation, and is credited with bringing Wall Street to Main Street. Win Smith is currently the majority owner and president of Sugarbush Ski and Golf Resort in Vermont. Smith remains a vocal critic of past management at Merrill and is a sought-after voice for his insight on corporate governance. The other guest was Jim Ladinsky. Jim is currently president of Corporate Securities Advisors, a consulting firm that specializes in expert witness testimony in bankruptcy cases like Enron. Jim was a principal at Morgan Stanley and also held managing director positions at First Chicago Capital Markets and A.G. Becker. A large portion of the class was Q&A, and we'll pick up there with the students' question on a theme that remained constant throughout the morning: corporate culture.
I think you can keep it partially. I mean, there is a question. There are reasons why, Wall Street firms weren't allowed to be corporations, much less public corporations, for many years. That only happened in the 1970s. Merrill became a corporate entity in 1958, became a public corporation in 1971. But after 1971, the vast majority of our employees were shareholders. They were shareholders, and I think it was more than monetary. I think it was attitudinal. We really believed that it was our company, and we also believed we had an obligation, the people that gave us the jobs, to the people that worked for us, and to the future generations. And that came about, again, through leadership. It came about when I sat with Dan Tully as the CEO, and he had us in a room as a team, and we argued. We had the ability to comment on somebody else's, structure, somebody else's business, whether we were going to take the risk. And we were free to debate and argue as partners. And at the end of the day, his only rule was when we make a decision, we go out as a team. But in that, there could be heated debate. So I think attitudinally, that's important. But it's harder. It's harder. And, when you're playing with other people's money, the old Milton Friedman rule is people spend other people's money differently than they spend their own is really true. So if you have a trader sitting on a $10 billion book, they don't, that's paper. That's like playing a video game. It's not your own money. And I think people like John Whitehead and John Weinberg at Goldman argued for years not to let Goldman go public because when you're spending your own money and it's really at risk, you think about the world very differently. So I think it's key. I don't know that you're going to go back to partnerships, but I think you really have to build in internal governance and internal attitude that people realize they're not just playing video games, they're playing with real money.
Let's take the Merrill Board of Directors. If we read each individual's bio, we would go, wow, great accomplishments, started out, rose up to lead a major Fortune 500 company, very impressive individually. What happens to those 15 individuals when they get in an air-conditioned room on the 40th floor that they can't act together the way they acted when they were CEOs?
Yeah,
you've sat in that room. What happens?
We're on the record here. I can't tell you that. But it's certainly not what you hope will happen always. And, I think there was a great study I read years ago at Harvard Business School about groupthink. And, some of the worst decisions have been made by groupthink where everybody nods their head and nobody is really allowed because of the culture to object. And, how are boards selected, frankly? How the CEO selects the board, right? There's a nominating committee, but it's fake. Okay, they select people They select people who are going to look good on the board. Either they're going to, have diversity, or they're going to have people that, have good pedigrees. But they're not selecting people to challenge them. They're not selecting people who are going to be really independent. Now, I'm not sure how that happens, but I think it has to happen. And I would say that one of the things the SEC and any regulator should think about is, what is the process going to be going forward? The European model of having an independent chair, a real independent chair other than the CEO, nobody likes that, because that's threatening. That is threatening. But maybe we should be considering that. There have been a lot of gadflies who have, tried to get cumulative voting put in, and nobody wants cumulative voting, because then I can get all my votes to get you off the board. How many boards are actually unelected? Very, very few. So I think it's a complex question. I don't know the answer to it, but I do think that strong CEOs, would like to have strong boards. Not radical people on the board, but people who are going to challenge them.
When Bloomberg TV continues, we'll look at whether firing John Thain was a good idea so soon after the deal was consummated. Did Thain deserve it, or was Ken Lewis using him as a scapegoat? Welcome back to Bloomberg's Masterclass. Win Smith Jr., the son of one of Merrill's principal founders, fielded questions recently from students of the Warrington College of Business at the University of Florida. When asked about his former CEO, Stan O'Neill, Smith didn't seem concerned about hurting any feelings.
I'm sure there was a lot of opposition in the ranks of the leadership at Merrill. How difficult was it for the leaders who were opposed to Stan O'Neill's kind of thinking to stick their neck out and say something, or for the most part were they pushed aside and
No, they had their head chopped off. Yeah, so they didn't speak. Some people, I fortunately had the financial flexibility to do something else. A lot of people did not. And a lot of people will tell you today is they didn't like it there. They didn't agree with it, but they were earning good money, they needed a job, they had families, and there was a bit of a culture of fear. There was a silo mentality that built up where, the people distributing mortgage securities, they weren't permitted to say, we can't sell this junk. They weren't in the decision, and that happened. Institutional people were saying, there's not a market for this, and we kept adding it to the balance sheet. And I think that, again, culturally was one of the things that changed that led to some of the consequences.
And how do you think the government can incentivize, or the corporate leaders of the world can incentivize a culture of ethics and cooperation that results in long-term success, instead of greed and ruthless competition that lead to short-term profits?
I'm not sure you can legislate morality or ethics. I think that's very difficult. I think what you have to do is have regulation that creates, some real good transparency and creates, certain safety bounds. But, it comes back to trust, and if you're in business, I'm in a business of customer service. So if my clients don't trust the service I'm delivering and don't believe in me and, don't think I'm telling the truth, they can go ski somewhere else. So if you're in the financial business, I think it comes down to the same thing. Everything starts at the top. It really is, leadership starts with what the leader is doing as well as what he's saying. There's the accountability on the part of the board and on behalf of the shareholders to make sure that that right leader is put into place. And I think you've hit a key thing right now. Why is Wall Street under such a microscope right now? Basically, it's destroyed its trust. Main Street doesn't like it, okay? Main Street is looking and they're saying people are losing money, causing us pain, causing the banks not to lend to us anymore, and they're walking away with $16 million of 16. I forgot a zero. $160 million of severance pay. That doesn't seem fair. It just doesn't seem fair, and frankly, it's not fair. So I think you're on at a key point. Is everybody has to really regain the trust and the confidence of Main Street, and they're going to have to do it through their actions. And at the end of the day, I think most Americans applaud wealth creation as long as it's done appropriately. I think people applaud a Bill Gates, who builds something in a shop, or, a Steve Jobs who builds something in his garage, and he's the richest man in the world. You applaud that. What you don't applaud is people that inherit a seat that was created by others, and they think they were responsible for the creation of that company and then should be paid what Alex Rodriguez is paid. So, that envy, I think, has really caused a lot of skepticism on Main Street. But I don't think you can legislate that. I think, what you have to do is you have to legislate that there is transparency in how compensation is being awarded, who's accountable, why they're paid. Should the shareholders vote on compensation? I think that's a big question. I think there are pluses and minuses to that. I'm not really in favor of that, but I am in favor of holding the board of directors accountable for their executive pay decisions.
Is the government going to be able to finance the deficit?
I'm worried about, the amount of the stimulus and also the direction of the stimulus. I'm worried that some of what is being done really isn't stimulus, but it, is politically focused on some programs. Question about who's going to pay for it, who's going to finance it, is a really good question. On the way over, I mentioned to Bruce and Jim, I saw a cartoon in the paper the other day, and it was regulators grilling Bernie Madoff, and they said, "Where did you learn about this scheme?" And he said, "It was easy, Social Security." You think about it. Social Security right now is a Ponzi scheme. You're basically paying out by other people paying in. It isn't a funded program. And so I think you're raising some really good questions. But on the other hand, we're in the middle of a big problem. We're in the worst economy since the 1920s. I think we have to probably err on the side of spending more rather than less to get, the economy going, get confidence coming back in. So, it's easy to be a backseat driver right now. Time's going to tell, but I am a little concerned about the size, the direction, and how it will be financed long term.
When Bloomberg's Masterclass continues, Win Smith tells us about two different realities, the one on Wall Street and the one in the real world. Stay with us. Welcome back to Bloomberg's Masterclass. The Merrill Lynch Bank of America deal was announced in September, but by the end of January, John Thain was gone. Did Ken Lewis make the right call? We spent the day with the capitalism class at the University of Florida's Wharton Business School. Students and teachers both weighed in on one of the biggest business stories of the year.
Fair to say that this isn't necessarily the outcome that I would have expected when I took this job.
Why did Ken Lewis fire John Thain so early in the marriage? And was it a good idea? It's very clear that if he was going to be a scapegoat, and there were a couple of things that he was being, people were pointing to as far as his office, which, by the way, may have been contracted earlier. It was those bonuses that were paid in December instead of January. What I really think drove that were the losses. I think the losses that John Thain didn't have a lot to do with other than he came in with a spectacular record, and not only at Goldman Sachs, but what he did at the New York Stock Exchange. I mean, he was Mr. Fix-It, and he has a lot of talent. But more importantly than that, I think there is obviously a challenge on keeping the financial advisors. They're entrepreneurs in a way. They all have their own book. In fact, I happened to deal with Merrill, and I can recall what they were like 15, 20 years ago, how they operated, and how now it was basically one person. Now you have a team in most cases, and they're really outstanding teams, 3 or 4, 6 or 8, whatever, and it's almost like you got your own little private group. And so they're really doing that right, and I think there's a good chance that part can grow and prosper, and what I'm really more worried about is the investment banking side. To make this thing really work, I think you need to have the investment bankers, the commercial bankers somehow get on the same page. And I have been told that a good number of the investment bankers are sort of going the regional or the startup, and in fact some have enough in the bank that they're going to take a 6 or 12 or 18-month sabbatical figure out what the financial service industry is going to look like. I think we are at a point here that it is, it's like walking, on sand. I mean, if you've ever been in a riptide, or you've been out on the beach. I grew up in Michigan, and you're standing there, and you're standing, but the sand's moving from underneath. It's a funny feeling, and I think that's where we are. I think that Thane, if he'd have stayed around, I think he really would have been a presence that would have been very helpful in keeping the investment bankers and that whole part.
These CEOs had two bosses, their duty to the shareholders of the company, as well as the pressure that was put on them by the regulators and government officials. I was hoping that maybe you could give us some insight into what you think the conflict will result in going forward.
You're in a war, and your boss, who's a key regulator, is telling him, for the sake of the economy, you got to go through with it. And maybe there were some assurances given. But you've got that's probably one of the really toughest problems that's gonna have to be resolved out of this. I mean, I just don't think there could even be a waiver, to be honest. I mean to the disclosure issue to shareholders.
What do you think would have happened if the deal did not go through, if the merger wasn't executed?
My view is if that merger had been stopped right at some point, the government would have had to step in some form, either with another party and guaranteeing a certain amount of liability. I mean, Lehman Brothers was a real shock. Not that a large institution was allowed to fail, but the ramifications it had on the marketplace. I mean,